Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to look at the basic keyboard shortcuts. And what I want to look at here is just the core keyboard shortcuts in 3ds Max. And then later on in the chapter, we're going to look at user interface features that may not be immediately obvious. Now, as I said, I'm not going to look at everything here in terms of keyboard shortcuts. If you do want to check them out yourself, you can go to the Customize menu, Customize User Interface, Keyboard, and then you've got all of these different groups here of different functionality areas in 3ds Max. For instance, working with views, and then you can check out the different keyboard shortcuts here yourself. But as I said, I'm not going to go through everything, so I'm just going to concentrate here on some of the key keyboard shortcuts. So as an example, let's start off with translation. So let me just create a teapot, and I'm going to move it here. So we're automatically at the moment in transform mode. You can see we've got the different options up here. We've got select and move, we've got rotate, and we've got scale. I want to change to rotation, so I press E, R for scale, and W for move. So that's once again W for move, E for rotation, R for scale. And I believe actually these keyboard shortcuts are the same as in Maya. So if you're coming from Maya, if you're a user of Maya, then these will be familiar with you, which is actually pretty cool. Makes it much easier to move across. Now, if you want to lock your selection, in other words, if you select this teapot and you want to keep the selection, you can just press space, and you can see that this lock icon comes on down here. And now, when I click in the viewport, you can see I can't actually unselect this teapot. I'm locked to having it selected. And this actually brings in another keyboard shortcut, or a set of keyboard shortcuts, which are the axis constraints. And those are F5, F6, F7, and F8. F5 blocks you to doing translations just on the x-axis. F6 blocks you to Y, F7 to Z, and F8 gives you combinations of two axes, and it's a toggle. So press it once and we get XY, press it twice and we get ZY, press it 3 times and we get ZX. And we can just cycle between those just by pressing F8 over and over. If we press F5 and I try and move, don't forget I'm locked to this teapot. I'm actually moving the mouse around in 3 dimensions. I think you can see my cursor moving here. But you can see it's actually only moving in X. If I press Y, you can see we're locked to just moving it in Y. Z, we're locked just to Z. And then if we press F8, we use planar combinations. So you can see we can actually lock our selection, and then we can actually move our teapot around just in certain planes by using F5, F6, F7, and then F8. Those are the axis constraints. Next, we have the viewport keyboard shortcuts, which I think we hit on a little bit earlier, but I'm just going to go through them again. And we have L for left, T for top, B for bottom, F for front, P for perspective, U for user, and C for camera. But you actually have to have a camera set up for that to work. So there you go. Those are the different options. As I said, once again, L for left, F for front, B for bottom, T for top, P for perspective, U for user, and C for camera. And there's also one more keyboard shortcut, which back in the day, as I said earlier in this DVD, used to be set to R, which is now changed to being scale. But that used to be the right view, but now you have to press Alt and R to change the right view. And also back in the day, I believe back, you've got front these days, but there used to be a back view as well, which is obviously the opposite. That used to be set to K, but that's actually assigned to another command these days. So if you want to, you can go into the user interface and reassign those using the customize user interface keyboard options. There's one last view keyboard shortcut, and that's V. And that actually brings up this neat little menu where you can actually choose whichever view you want. So that's actually pretty cool. You can just click it and you can do top view or bottom view or right view, left view, front view, isometric, camera, or perspective, or whatever view it is that you want to work in, then you can just very quickly get it by using that keyboard shortcut. Now for the next thing we need a few more objects, so let me just clone some copies here of the teapot. Holding shift down to do that, and then moving the teapots, and it gives me the option to clone them. So let's say I want to select all of the teapots. Then I can just press Control A, and it selects all of the objects on the level that I'm working at. Now what I mean by level is, let's say if we change one of these teapots into an editable mesh, and we can go into vertex mode, and I can press Control A and it selects all the vertices. I can go into edge mode, press Control A and it selects all of the edges. Face mode, it selects all of the faces. I think you get the idea. Control A basically selects everything. There's another command which is Control Invert, and that allows you to invert your selection. So if we select an object and press Control I, then we select the objects that we currently have selected. Let me just see if that works on a sub-object level. Control I. No, it doesn't. So it seems to actually only work on an object level, from what I can see. Actually, let me just try it on an edit mesh here. Convert to editable. Sorry, edit poly, I mean. Let's see if it actually works on that. Control I. Yes, it does. So you can see it actually does work on more than one level. So that's a pretty good keyboard shortcut. So remember those two. Control A, select everything. Control I, invert your current selection. So we've been working with the transform gizmo, so let's actually have a look at what we can do with that. We can hide the transform gizmo by pressing X on the keyboard. So as you can see, that hides it. And while we're in that state, we can actually lock our selection and choose one of the constraints to actually still move the object. And this actually is the way that you used to move things around in 3ds Max before they introduced the gizmo. So even with the gizmo hidden, you can still actually move objects in quite an easy manner just by locking it and moving it in that way. If you want to bring it back, we'll just unlock by pressing space, press X. We've got our gizmo back. If the size of the gizmo isn't very useful, then you can always change that with the plus and minus keys on the main keyboard. Plus makes it bigger, minus makes it smaller, and if you're in rotation mode, for instance, making it larger actually gives you a finer level of control while you're actually rotating, because the relative movement of the rotation is actually smaller because of the large size of the wheel going around. So sometimes making the gizmo larger can give you more control, and sometimes the gizmo can be too large. If you've got multiple objects and you have multiple gizmos, then they can get in the way. They can make the display very messy, so you can always shrink those down with the plus and minus keys. Next, we'll just look at the snap keyboard shortcuts, and the two main snaps that we'll be looking at in this DVD are the 3D snaps and the angle snaps. They're the ones which I personally find the most useful. And as it turns out, we actually have some keyboard shortcuts for those. If you want to turn on the 3D snaps, then you just press S, and as you can see, it gets turned on. It gets toggled by pressing S. If you press the key A, then we get angle snaps turned on. We can just toggle that again by pressing A back and forth. So we'll be looking at what they do later on in the DVD, but you know, just remember those two keyboard shortcuts. S allows you to turn on 3D snaps, and A allows you to turn on and off angle snaps. When we select any of these teapots, you can see that when we're in shaded mode, we get this big box, this bounding box that shows up around our current selection. And you can see as I select each object, you get this bounding box. Now, the other thing you get is that the wireframe turns white. So as long as your object doesn't have a white wireframe, which is actually possible, then you can tell that the object selected by the fact that it has a white wireframe. So why do you have this selection box as well? Well, a lot of people say that. So you can actually hide it just by pressing J on the keyboard. And from then on, you don't have these selection brackets. And they can actually get quite overpowering. If you have a lot of objects, you have a lot of these brackets, just press J and they go away. And as I said, you can just see what you have selected by the fact that the wireframe is highlighted in white. And then we have another feature, which you can see I've activated here by using the keyboard shortcut, and it's called active degradation. And what it does is, as you can see, it switches to a box mode whenever you pan the viewport or orbit around. And the reason for this is that back in the day, graphics cards were much slower than they are now, and really they couldn't handle displaying thousands of objects in shaded mode or wireframe mode. And therefore there was a dropback feature, which was that when you're rotating around the viewport, you could actually use this active degradation. So you would actually get a viewport speed up when you were orbiting and navigating around your scene. These days, to be honest, it's not really needed unless you're working in a very heavy scene. And the main reason I'm telling you about this keyboard shortcut is because sometimes people hit it by accident. It's O, If we press O on the keyboard, that turns it off. And then if we press O again, that turns it back on again. And some people accidentally turn it on by going to hit another key. For instance, going to hit the P key, they hit the O key instead, and they end up with active degradation on. And then when they move around, they get this box view, and it it really annoys them, and they don't know how to get rid of it. So that's the culprit. It's the O key, and you can press that to turn off active degradation, and therefore from then on you just get the full quality display, which today with modern graphics cards is really pretty good most of the time. That's it for the keyboard shortcuts, but let's have a look at a few more other user interface features before we finish off here. I'll start off with using keyboard shortcuts with things like spinners. What we can do is we can hold down Control, and if I actually, let me just move up and down on this spinner manually first. I'm just moving up and down here with nothing selected. And then let me do it with Control held down. That's actually a lot faster. And then if I hold down Alt, it's much slower now. So I'm moving the mouse the same kind of distance, but with Control I get accelerated response, and with Alt I get retarded response. So I can make much finer adjustments with Alt held down, and with Control I can make much larger adjustments. With neither, I get the middle ground. And another thing, if I'm orbiting around the view like this, and then if I hold down Shift, you can see it actually snaps me into a constraint to just one of the axes. So let me just do that. I'm just zooming around here, orbiting around our objects, and then if I hold down Shift, we just get locked onto either the horizontal axis or the vertical axis. You can actually constrain your orbit to just one of those two axes just by holding down the Shift key. And also the Control key comes into play when we're creating objects. If I hold down Control and I make a teapot, for instance, as I create it, you can see I can actually rotate it as I'm creating it, which is something that you can't do by default. You can actually choose the direction in which the spout faces. And if I do the same thing with a box and I hold down Control, you can see that I can't make anything other than a square box. So again, that's pretty cool. And I believe that works with a plane also. It actually constrains the plane to being square. Whereas normally you can create a box and a plane of any real dimensions that you want. So that's where the Control key comes into play there. And if you want to change the way your viewport works, you can just right click on any of the view titles up here, like perspective, and it comes up with a menu where you can choose the display type for that particular viewport, wireframe, or you can change to facets and highlights, or flat shaded, and so on. You can just choose different options there. And you can see there's quite a few other options here. Also, you can right click down here on one of the orbiting tools and it comes up with a viewport configuration, where there are a lot of different options for setting up how your viewport works. And you can see one of these here is actually use selection brackets, so we could actually turn them back on here, go to shaded, and there they are, they're back again. I'll just press J and I've turned them off again. Now the next point is a very fine one, and what it allows you to do is actually rotate things in a slightly more controllable manner. When I do rotations here, I'm getting a certain amount of controllability, a certain sort of fineness of control. Now if I go up to preferences and I go to gizmos, I can choose how we rotate around an object, and it's currently using linear roll. If you want more control, you can choose circular crank, and now when you actually rotate, you'll get slightly more control in your rotations. So that's another option there. I'll just change it back to the standard option for now. And also we hit on the snap tools earlier, the keyboard shortcuts for them, A and S. Well, you can actually go in and change the preferences for these just by right clicking on any of these icons. These are all snaps here, so if you click on any of them, right click, it just brings up the preferences for that particular option, as you can see. So that's how you can actually set up what things is going to do a 3D snap to, how big the home grid is or whatever. It's all accessed by right clicking. Then it brings up the correct option where you can actually set how that particular snap works. And as I showed in the last chapter, you can expand the command panel just by pulling on its left edge, and that makes it larger, and that can be really useful for when you're working with object types or with modifiers that have a lot of different rollouts and you need that extra screen space. So that's a really cool feature to be aware of also. And we'll finish off with something which is a little bit esoteric, but which has caught out so many different people, it's not funny. It's where you have a dual monitor setup, which is what I have. We're only recording one of the screens, but I actually have multiple screens. Now, if I open up the material editor, here it is. Let's say I'm working and I move it over here onto my left monitor. So there we are, it's gone off onto my left monitor. Obviously, you can't see it anymore. Well, then let's say I close it and then I shut the Max file and I send it off to somebody else. And it loads up on their machine and they find that their material editor opens up off screen. I've just opened the material editor, but you can't see it, can you? And that's because it's off screen. It's on my second monitor. Well, that's a real pain because you might need to work with that material editor and you can't actually access it anymore. Before we finish up here, let me just show you how you fix that. And it's actually quite easy. First, you need to open the window, the offending window. And even though you can't see it, that window actually is selected at the moment. So we have that window selected, so we can do something with standard Windows commands to actually get that window back onto our main monitor. So to do that, we need to press Alt and space, and I'm doing that now. And even though you can't see it, that actually sets that window to go to its main menu. And one of the options in the main menu is Move. And to access that, you need to press Alt and M. And once that's done, Windows brings up a little cursor, and that allows you then to take control over that window using the mouse. Now, to activate that control, you have to press one of the arrow keys on the keyboard. So I'm just going to press the right arrow key. And then what that does is it locks that window to your mouse and also to the arrow keys. So if I wanted to now, I could scroll that window back onto the main window by pressing right. I'm going to press the right arrow keys. In a second, you should actually see that window turn up. There it is. You can see I can actually move it around the screen. And also I can do it with a mouse. So let me just show you how I do that again. I'll just close that. And in this case, we'll have it on screen so you can actually see this happening. Open the window, Alt space, Alt M. Then you get the little cursor that comes up. Press one of the arrow keys. That locks it to the mouse. And then we can move it around and you can place it. Or you can do Alt and then arrow keys, and then you can move it around with the arrow keys. I'm actually moving it around with the arrow keys now. And that's a real lifesaver. Believe me, I've actually worked on projects where, I've done particle effects, passed it on to another person in a different country. They couldn't actually see the particle window because it was on my second monitor, and they didn't have a second monitor, so they couldn't actually see that. So it's not directly related to anything in particular in this DVD, but it's just one of those cool little tips that I'm passing on to you. Okay, so I think you should have a pretty good idea how to navigate around your scene now. So let's get into some modeling nitty-gritty, and in the next chapter we're going to have a look at what polygons actually are.